Hello, welcome to this month's video teaching of Safe Space Community for Asians. This is session number 2. I'm Dr. Edmund, a licensed psychotherapist, and I'm your facilitator in SSC. The title of today's topic is The Jesus Model for Grief Support. You'll learn first of all about God's command to us to comfort all those who are grieving. And we want to know something about grief. What is the nature of grief? And I'll put to you then the biblical basis of the Jesus model for grief support. Before explaining to you in detail the techniques of the Jesus model in terms of the word time, T-I-M-E. T standing for telling the loss, I indicates the issues to be resolved, M refers to meaning to be sought, and E is ending and referral. So beginning with God's command to us for grief support. In the book of Isaiah, God says, comfort all who mourn. This is to us stated as a command, not as an option, that we are to reach out to comfort all those who mourn and are grieving. This is because we have a God who is compassionate, and He wants us to be compassionate to others, to comfort them when they are hurting. It doesn't matter if they are mourning over the loss of a loved one, or they are mourning as a people over the spiritual conditions of their nation. We are to comfort all who mourn. And God repeated this in Isaiah, said, comfort, comfort my people, as though God is shouting into our ears, hey, comfort, especially my people. So Jesus, when he was here on earth 2,000 years ago, preaching with his Sermon on the Mount, he said, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. He was saying that now that I have come, those who mourn will be comforted. But now Jesus is with God in heaven. Who does he expect to comfort others who are mourning? It is the body of Christ, meaning you and me. And the Apostle Paul says, don't just rejoice with people who rejoice. Also mourn with those who mourn. And James says, visit widows and the fatherless in their distress. The visit is not just to bring them out for shopping. The purpose is really to reach out to comfort them in their time of distress. So reaching out to others in grief support is not just the responsibility of grief counselors or church leaders, because the command of God, the command of our compassionate God is to us to reach out and comfort everybody. And let me build up the case for grief support in our times. It is said that grief support is protective against major depression, PTSD, and complicated grief, as well as being essential for a better quality of life. It is also said that in an increasingly mobile and secularized society with an aging population like ours, adults face more and more the prospects of dealing with deaths less supported by loved ones than other generations before us. And so we see at our times, there are more famines, more natural disasters, epidemics, and wars that cause massive loss of lives and properties around the world. And indeed, the seasons of loss and bereavement are windows of opportunity for us to impact lives and extend God's kingdom through grief support. And let us understand a bit more about grief. What is the nature of grief? Grief is the natural, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral consequence to any type of loss. It can be a tangible loss like a loss of health or loss of a loved one, loss of life, or something that's intangible like a divorce, a loss of friendship. But grief is a relational condition consequent to a loss. It is not a mental illness like depression. Although grief and depression, they have more or less the same symptoms. But because grief is something wired in us to feel sad over that loss of detachment, it is like the price we pay for our love. And so it is not a mental illness which requires us to take antidepressants as though we are in depression. And grief is a journey that we must undertake. It is best managed when it is experienced in a healthy and complete manner for the bereaved person to come to terms with the loss and move on in life. But when grief is bypassed or suppressed, normal grief can develop into complicated grief which prolongs the suffering and bringing along with it other psychosomatic illnesses which makes it even more painful. So what is grief and what is mourning? Grief is that natural consequence of loss. But mourning is the expression of one's grieving according to the bereaved's social or cultural settings or norms. So different cultures, different religions have different expectations on the style of mourning. And modern societies, and in particular Asian cultural and religious mindsets, are hostile to the process of proper and adequate grieving. For example, for the Chinese, death is seen as bad luck. Even the word death is viewed as a curse. So it is a toxic subject. It is something that people don't want to talk about, and that is like being forbidden. To the Indians, death is only a transition. So lamenting is also subdued. Whereas the Muslims, they see death as being fated by Allah. So extended mourning is prohibited. And what are the natural manifestations of grief? Because if we know what are the natural manifestations, the grieving people need not have to run to see the doctor and think that he or she is going crazy. But actually, that person is just having some more normal manifestations which are common to people who grieve. Emotionally, there will always be numbness. Numbness is that disorientation because grief is like a tangled ball of emotions which are overwhelming. And that is usually too much for the person. And there'll be a lot of crying, sadness due to the sadness for missing our loved one, for losing our loved one. And very often there is anger because one is frustrated that one has so little control over what is happening. And there is guilt. Guilt is also very common if I have done this or you have done that to prevent the loss from happening. So one harbors guilt. And one is anxious because so much of uncertainties ahead without our loved one. And one is lonely because one really miss the presence of the loved one. And grieving is something very tiring, and one feels static, and one feels depressed. And often, especially in the initial stages of the bereavement, the bereaved person wants to join the departed one, and there is suicidal ideation. Cognitively, the bereaved person may be thinking, am I dreaming or is this real? So there's disbelief. There's difficulty in concentration, causing confusion. And there's this obsessed thoughts of the disease, thinking that he's still alive. And so there will be hallucinations even in the day. And the bereaved person, for example, a widow, often will face an identity crisis. For example, when she is required to take what is a marital status, she will be very hesitant. Am I still married or single? And losing purpose in life because one loses hope as a whole and often isolates oneself and not meeting others. That is also a normal manifestation of grief. Behaviorally, that is this crying, and crying is good because there are benefits of crying. There's sleep disturbances, social withdrawal, change of appetite, having short attention span, and unhealthy escape of grief to avoid reminders. And there is this constant reliving of the loss, especially the last moments before our loved one died. And it's being played back like a broken record. So there are also physical manifestations like stomach or chest pains, constipation or diarrhea, vomiting, dryness of mouth or sore throat, breathing problems, headaches, cramps, rapid heart rate, and oversensitivity to noise, to name a few. Now, how do we look at grief? We have a traditional model put up by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was studying the stages of death of hospital patients, and she applied it to grief. First, there is this denial, then anger, then comes bargaining, then comes depression, and finally, acceptance and quiet resignation of one's impending death. And this is the same stages that's applied for grief. But this model was put up some 50 years ago, and we have a more contemporary models, and one of them is the dual process model. Stroop and Straub talks about oscillation between two complementary sets of coping processes. One is the loss orientation processes, which involves the grief work and the processing of the loss experience. And the other side is the restoration-orientated processes, which involves attending to life changes and distraction from grief. So there is this yo-yo between these two processes. As I said, there are three possible grief journeys. The grief will take time to build up to its maximum intensity, and that can take 2 weeks to 2 months. And after that, it will go up and down, but the general trend is downwards. And it may take up to 2 years before there is recovery and moving on in life. So this is what we call the normal grief chart. There is another possible journey path on top of this, whereby the grief journey goes on and on and on without resolution. And this develops into prolonged or complicated grief. That is where there is no grieving, proper grieving that is being carried out by the bereaved person. Where there is proper grieving and with support around them, the normal grief can in fact be shortened to 1 year or less. And this is seen at the bottom grief chart. Now, let me lay the biblical foundation for the Jesus model for grief support. Because if God wants us to reach out to support others in grief, logically, he must show us the way to do it. And I find the description of the passage in Luke 24 instructive, because this is where Jesus was talking to 2 grieving disciples. And so what Jesus modeled to us, it would be something that is more superior than other human approaches, because God is our maker. And being our maker, he knows human nature than any one of us. The context is this. On the day that Jesus resurrected, following his crucifixion, he journeyed alongside two of his disciples who were grieving over the cruel death of their master. They were returning home from Jerusalem on the way back to Emmaus. Jesus talked to them as a fellow traveler as they were kept from recognizing him. And Jesus started by asking, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" And so they poured out all they have gone through the last few days. We note that Jesus first asked them to talk about their lost experience. So I call this telling the lost. And from what they said, Jesus recognized that they have an issue that need to be resolved. And that is, they could not comprehend the reason for Jesus' crucifixion. And so he asked them, did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and enter his glory? This shows that issues has to be resolved. It is the second part of the grief work that has to be done. And what happened can be better understood by knowing the meaning and purpose to it to take place. And so beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. In other words, Jesus put them to the two disciples to see the big picture. And I call this meaning to be sought. And as they approached Emmaus, Jesus continued as if he was going further, signifying the ending of his counseling process. I call this ending and referral. So grieving over the loss of a loved one is a process, and it takes time to grieve. There are no quick fixes, and we cannot rush it through. And time can lessen the pain, and we can somewhat function again, but time alone will not heal. For the grief process to take progress, grief work has to be done. And the grief work in the time approach of Jesus comprises the following. First, the first grief work is telling the loss. The second grief work is issues that need to be resolved. The third grief work is meaning that need to be sought. And then ending and referral. So let me start with the first grief work, telling the loss. Experiencing a loss, especially the death of a loved one, can be traumatic. And like all forms of trauma, telling the loss with someone who can empathize with us is therapeutic. Telling the loss brings the bereaved person face to face with the reality of the death, confronts the denial, and actualizes the loss. In the beginning, there is always the denial, as though one is dreaming. Because it takes time for the full reality of the loss to sink in. And this is a protective mechanism that is put up by our bodies to protect one from being overwhelmed by all that is going on around the bereaved person. When the bereaved person feels understood, he or she is encouraged to further talk about the loss. So if there is an empathic person who understands what the bereaved person is telling, then this will encourage him or her to further talk about what she is going through. And if you're not ready to talk to anyone or not able to find someone who's empathic to you, the least you can do is to journal your thoughts. And there are other benefits of telling the loss. First, telling the loss helps the bereaved to process the loss experience and validates their struggles. It validates their emotions as they talk. it reduces the compulsion of replaying the loss in the mind over and over again. It switches the mindset to a more active mode of coping with the loss. And in telling the loss, it surfaces the issues that need to be resolved. And so what are the issues that need to be resolved? Why the issues? Because the issues can act as roadblocks to hinder the progress of the grieving process. And these issues has to be resolved as part of the grief work. The issues can get one stuck in the grief. There are many common issues, and emotionally, cognitively, there's denial, guilt, anger, anxiety, self-worth, suicidal tendency. These are very common. Practical issues such as domestic, financial, administrative, and legal matters. And the common spiritual issues usually are unforgiveness and the issue of one's trust in God. So let me give you some illustrations as to how these issues can be dealt with, starting with the issue of guilt. Guilt is very common. Almost in all cases, after loss, there will be guilt. When you hear, if I only have done this, if I only had not done this, then she would not have died. These statements indicates the presence of guilt. And guilt can be real guilt or false guilt. 90% of all cases involves false guilt. False guilt has no valid basis. They are mostly superficial compensations to bear the responsibility for the loss, because one cannot prevent the loss. And so there must be something that one can blame as a handler for the person to hold on to. And false guilt can be dispelled by subjecting it to an evaluation of rationality or reality. In other words, you have to objectively reason with the bereaved person. For example, a man who lost his wife to cancer may say that if I have done more for her, then she would not have died. And so if you want to reach out, you can say, well, did not you tell me that you looked for the best oncologist in town and you brought her to being treated by him? You also told me that you did a lot of research on alternative medicine and she tried some of this. Isn't that doing a lot rather than not doing enough for her? As a third person, I can see that there's no basis for your guilt of not doing enough for her before she died. In the case of real guilt, it can be resolved through confession, seeking forgiveness, and facing the consequences. Now, another illustration of how we can help to resolve the anger. Anger is expressed as a protest of the loss. And often one gets angry with people, with God, with others, with the self, is because one is frustrated that someone has to be blamed for it. And so anger is often deflected to the most convenient targets of blame, or retroflected inwards to be angry with oneself. So a man whose wife died of cancer may find the doctor to be a convenient target and get angry for him for being not competent enough. Or the man can be angry at God that despite the praying, God did not intervene to heal the wife. Alternatively, he can be angry with himself, as in the previous illustration, for not doing enough for his wife. So we need to help the bereaved identify the real target of the anger. Talk and vent out the anger at the real cause of the loss. His wife died of cancer. His wife did not die because of somebody doing this or not doing that. And so if the anger is vented at the disease of cancer. One cannot keep on be angry at cancer for too long. How about dealing with suicidal ideation? The thought of dying is a normal manifestation at the beginning of bereavement. And only regular monitor of the bereaved person is necessary. However, the bereaved must be referred to professional help immediately when the suicidal ideation lasts more than 2 months after the bereavement, or there are telltale signs of specific plans to harm oneself, or they are disposing of valuable assets to prepare for their suicide, and they are putting personal affairs in order. Now, how about domestic issues? Here's an illustration of what caregivers can do. The newly bereaved usually takes more than a month to realize the practical implications of what it is to live without the disease. So caregivers can provide practical help in many ways, including bringing cooked food, helping in household work, running errands, offering transportation, and making difficult calls for them. But eventually, we need to help them to make decisions independently and learn effective problem solving and coping skills so that they will not continue to rely and be dependent on us. How about some spiritual issues? How do we deal with them? Grief shakes us to the core and often reveals to us true spiritual conditions of our hearts. As the grief brings to the surface some ugly aspects of ourselves that shock even us, this is a good time for spiritual house cleansing. When negative thoughts, emotions, and behaviors suggest the presence of past unforgiveness, bitter roots, inner vows, ask the bereaved person to pray to God to reveal to them the original incidents that gave rise to each of them. And then they ought to confess each sin that God reveals. And in the process, for any unrepented sin of hurting others, as God reveals, they must also ask God for forgiveness. And meanwhile, Christian caregivers ought to avoid the temptation of relentlessly throwing Bible verses at the bereaved. Scriptures are the eternal word of God. But at a time when all the bereaved ones is relieved from their pain, we are not helping to address their emotions if all we do is to preach at them. And for people of other faiths, we need to explore with them what their core spiritual beliefs are with respect to sin and forgiveness before supporting them in dealing with their spiritual issues. And so moving on to grief work number 3, meaning to be sought. When the loss of a loved one is untimely, unexpected, such a death can shake the very foundations of our assumptive work. To come to terms with the loss, one will search for meaning to make sense of the loss experience. And until one comes to a conclusion or belief that accommodates the fragility of life and the limits of our control over it, the grieving process will be hampered and recovery is delayed. The most common questions in our quest for meaning in loss is usually, why me? Why must this happen to me or my family? Why at this time? Why a good God allow all these sufferings? Why bad things happen to good people? And when this why has been going on for too long and God is silent, we need to switch from the human to God's perspective. Because having the answers to all the why questions will not change the reality of the loss. And insisting on knowing all the answers can be counterproductive. Of course, if wrongdoing is involved, the family can pursue justice by legal means, but revenge should not be part of the motivation. And if we believe that God is in control, then we must accept that all deaths are permitted by God. In that sense, no death is premature. When the disease time on earth is up, we cannot prevent the loss by our human efforts or control. After all, to the departed, how the person dies is no longer relevant to him or her, as they are in another dimension of existence. And so what remains is for us to make our season of loss productive. The reality is that each one of us must finally give an account to God about our own life when our time on earth is up. It is not tied up with the lives of our loved one, whether alive or dead. And you are not dead, even if your loved one is gone, for you are still responsible with the way you live your life. So you do not want to waste your season of pain and suffering, even as you grieve over the loss of your loved one. Let God redeem our suffering and help us to emerge a better person, not a bitter person, following our loss experience. We have to bear in mind that the overarching purpose for which God put each one of us on earth is for Him to refine us so that we are more suited to live with Him in eternity. So through all the ups and downs in life, He wants to refine our character. And therefore our focus must not be solely on getting a lot of money, getting a lot of experiences, getting a lot of power or fame or properties, which we cannot take along. What we can take along is only our character, because it is our character that God will assess us at the end. And therefore, if we are in grief, it is a very good time for us, for God to deal and further work on our character. And so how can a caregiver help in the bereaved search for meaning? Guide and point them to God and not elsewhere to seek for humanistic answers. Encourage them to rest in God and come before God with spiritual brokenness and total abandonment. Teach them to wait patiently before God and in the process grow in faith in Him. In the process, grow in our Christ-likeness. Persuade them to journey their struggles and thoughts until they come into the context and perspective that will satisfy their search for the meaning of their loss. And finally, ending and referral. Grieving is a process, and the bereaved will never return to the status quo of the pre-loss circumstances, but enters into a new normal of living without the disease. And how do we assess recovery? The general totality of the following factors suggests that recovery has taken place. First, one is able to talk with the disease, about the disease without intense pain, although still feeling sad over the loss from time to time. One regains an interest in life and starts to reinvest in others. Feels more hopeful in life, can adapt to one's new identity and new role, and accepts that there are still bad days in the years ahead. When is it time to refer? Clues that suggest that referral to professional help becomes necessary. The bereaved is still overwhelmed by grief without progressing towards recovery after 2 years. There is disproportionate fear of death of the same sickness suffered by the disease. Unresolved theme repeatedly coming up in daily conversations, neglect of health or abuse in drugs or alcohol following the loss, extended preoccupation with suicidal thoughts, no desire to resume to normal daily functioning after 2 years, and unexplained physical or mental health problems, many in the form of psychosomatic symptoms. And if you want to know more about the Jesus model for grief support, you can read this book. It is available at amazon.com, either in the Kindle or paperback versions. So this comes to the end of this month's teaching video. I wish to thank you for watching our SSC series. This is session number 2, and the topic is on grief support. To receive our latest blogs, emails, monthly video teachings, and the links to our weekly Saturday morning conversations, kindly subscribe to our website, and we look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now.